I just wanted to talk about where we are in the course, both issues in Jewish theology. You know, when I was first asked to teach this course, I kind of looked at the topic and I was, my jaw dropped. It's like, issues in Jewish theology. It's like stuff in the solar system. Give me some specific... So we started with exploring Jewish theology writ large, and then with the Gilman reading, Buber, Rosenzweig, existentialism. Then we went to specific 20th century thinkers. Since I had a whole course on Heschel and Soloveitchik last year, we skipped them and we started doing Levinas, Leibovitch, Echad Ha'am, Rav Kook. And today, we kind of bid farewell to modern Jewish thought with the leading Jewish theologian and rabbinic figure from the non-Haredi world of our time, and one of the leading theologians in the world, of any religion really, contending with religious violence today, which is the greatest source of global conflict. And after today, we will move to classical rabbinical texts, right? We have the Tanya by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, and we'll go back to more classical issues in Jewish thought, like good and evil, body and soul, things of that nature. And we also have The Soul of Life, Nefesh HaChaim by Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, one of the leading disciples of the Vilna Gaon, to kind of complement Hasidic psychology with the Kabbalistic ethics of an arch misnagid. And in addition, time allowing, we might start exploring the path of the righteous, Mesilat Yesharim, which is one of the classical work of Musar, the Jewish movement of ethical self-refinement. So that's where we are today. We're bidding farewell to modern and contemporary Jewish thought with this most timely thing. So I said that, Cynthia made a very fair point that it's a very long and dense book. Very appropriately, Cynthia, emailed asking, what should we really focus upon? And I said, the first two parts. So I hopefully you've had an opportunity to read at least most of the opening two parts. So I'll try and do something very ambitious. I'll try to lead us for the first part through the book, and then the second part we'll have the discussion. Okay? I think it's a very dense text, and there is a lot in it. I have the original English, which I read it in originally. I also have the Hebrew to consult some of the specifically biblical and Torah passages in the original. I also made my markings this time in my Hebrew text because I read faster in Hebrew. But obviously we're relying on the English original and on the Hebrew for the primary scriptural and rabbinic text. So, Sachs starts by saying that monotheism in Judaism appears as a critique of power, as the tyranny of Pharaoh's Egypt and the tyranny of Abram's Mesopotamia. And he has the term altruistic evil. Altruistic evil is if you're very wealthy and you live in Beirut, Lebanon, and your father just bought you a new Mercedes, but you still exploded yourself into the Twin Towers, that's altruistic evil, right? One of the terrorists in 9/11, there's a documentary, they interview his father, and his father tells him, I bought you a new Mercedes, it's waiting for you in the garage. And he said, I won't be home anytime soon, give the Mercedes to my sister. Completely true, right? So altruistic evil, I think it's self-explanatory, right? Altruistic evil is when people perpetrate crimes against humanity and sacrifice themselves. Suicide bombers exhibit altruistic evil. He goes on to say that there are three ways to contemplate the linkage between religion and violence. One is religion is the chief source of violence, so let's cancel religion. The second one is denial. Religion has nothing to do with violence. And the third one is splitting, to use a psychological term. Their religion is the problem. Our religion is just swell, right? And of course, Rabbi Sachs says that all of these are wrong, and he's going to say that what's really the source of these things. He comes up with the term groupishness. The very fact that humans exist in groups can lead potentially to another philosophical term he introduces, namely pathological dualism, right? You guys are less than human, and we are fully human. You know, we are the sources of light, you are the sources of evil, right? Pathological dualism, right? But it is not exclusive to religious groups, right? We've seen that under Nazism, for example, right? This pathological dualism. He talks fascinatingly about how in the 1600s knowledge was secularized with Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Politics was secularized in the 1700s with the American and French Revolution. The 1800s with galleries and museums, the secularization of culture. And he says in the 60s, if you can remember the 60s, which most people who are in the 60s probably don't remember the 60s, just kidding, came the secularization of morality. And now people feel that a lot of, in the secular world, that we no longer need religion, theology. It's no longer something that humanity needs to resort to. But Jonathan Sachs says it's just that the secularists left out or forgot one thing, that Homo sapiens is the meaning-seeking animal. That's his definition of humanity, the meaning-seeking animal, and that no show on Netflix and no new smartphone can answer the three existential cardinal questions of life, which are, who am I, why am I here, and how should I live, right? Why am I here? It's not for the instructor's fee, I promise you. I just love teaching and learning with you guys. Who am I, why am I here, and how should I live? These core existential questions, science cannot answer them. In the name of Auguste Comte, C-O-M-T-E, the founding father of modern positivism, the exact sciences ask how, right? How does water boil? Descriptive questions. And the humanities and religion and spirituality asks why rather than how. Why? Right? Okay. There's so much. He talks about moral relativism of our time. He talks about the connection between the new technology of information technology and how it helps recruit people into radical evil, predominantly today ISIS, Al-Qaeda, radical Islam, but not only, also white supremacists who just butchered Jews and Muslims in Pittsburgh and New Zealand, respectively. Makes an important point, says you win the war with weapons, but you win the peace with the power of ideas. And the notion that came to my mind is the Marshall Plan after World War II. After World War I, Germany was brought to its knees, skyrocketing inflation. The result was the rise of the Nazis. After World War II, the Allies learned their lesson. And instead of downtrodden Germany, they actually made it their business to rebuild the German economy and to democratize Germany. And the result is, very different. he mentions, he talks about the will to life as opposed to the will to power, and he shares with us the astounding observation. He has a great lecture about it on YouTube. Has Europe lost its soul? Why is Europe dying? And you see that from Portugal in the west to Russia in the east, all of Europe has a negative birth rate. That is to say, factually, physically, Europe is dying. Indigenous Europeans, they're dying out as a society. What conversely, what we see is that in religious groups, from Haredi Jews to evangelicals, Christians, to pious Muslims, they have a staggering birth rate. So we see that the world is going to get more and more religious simply on demographic grounds, right? He mentions also Jewish fundamentalism, the murderer of Yitzhak Rabin, who was an Orthodox Jew, Baruch Goldstein, the one who massacred Palestinians in the cave of the matriarchs and patriarchs in Hebron in 94. Actually kind of gave a sermon about all this on Shabbat. And he says that one of the reasons we're seeing this outburst of new violence is because the world is changing at a staggering pace, and it breeds what the sociologist Durkheim called anomie. A-N-O-M-I-E. Anomie means a loss of underlying values and principles at times of accelerated societal, political, economic change. And that's what we see with accelerated globalization coupled with information technology. He talks, of course, about the primacy of identity, and he says that there is a linkage between religion and violence, but it is indirect. Meaning there is basically the direct link is between group and violence. It could be two nation states, right? It could be two religions. It could be two ethnicities. But it's really the in and out dynamic of the human condition. And he's basically going to say there were 3 times to opt out of particular identity, in at least in the West. One was when Christianity and Islam tried to assert themselves as a universal empire and to nullify all other religions. The second was with the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, that everybody would be nice secularists leaning on the faculty of reason. And the third one was with the grand political ideologies, secular atheistic ideologies of the 20th century, fascism, Nazism, and communism. He says in all these 3 cases, it was a colossal failure. You cannot undo the group dynamic because you cannot undo meaning and belongingness. These are inherent human needs. And once you try to take God out of the picture, you end up deifying something else, like the nation state, right? Or the Japanese emperor, or Papa Stalin, right? Our father Stalin. Instead of saying Avinu Malkeinu, our father a king, you deify Stalin or Hitler. So he says whenever people try to completely take God out of the picture, the result is the deification of an other. Either a conceptual other, like the state or some ideology, or a personal other. In any case, it accounts for political idolatry, right? So all of this is very, very deep stuff. So what are we? Are we angelic beings or are we demonic beings? Well, he says we're both. We have Mahatma Gandhis in our midst, but we also have Dr. Mengeles in our midst. Us being humanity, right? Right. It says that the human tendency is to exhibit chesed, loving kindness, towards those who are in group, not those who are always out of the group. Makes a very interesting linguistic point that the word religion derives from the Latin religar, R-E-L-I-G-A-R-E, which means to bind together, right? So religion binds people together. Makes me think of the tefillin too, and how you bind yourself to, values beyond yourself. So once again, violence is not about religion, it's about living in groups writ large. And I mentioned what were the great attempts to undo groupishness. Okay. The chapter 3 talks about dualism. Let me see if there's any specific comment I want to give you. We talked about pathological dualism. And pathological dualism, let's say, ISIS saying the Jews are swines and monkeys. So what does pathological dualism does? It dehumanizes and demonizes the enemy. It encourages the person, let's say the ISIS terrorist, to see him or herself as a victim, and then to perpetrate acts of altruistic evil. And what it takes away from us is the capacity for empathy and sympathy. I'll add my own remark that it's fascinating that, in the Torah, redemption starts with empathy. Did I speak about this in this class? That empathy starts with, tell me if I did, stop me if I did, that Moses empathically chose his biological family over his billionaire adopting family. And then he chose his people by killing the Egyptian cop who was practically lynching the Hebrew slave. And then he exhibited empathy to 4 Midianite women, non-Jewish women who were being harassed by a group of shepherds. And then he had empathy, according to the Midrash, to this straying sheep that didn't have water. And at that point, he merited revelation of the divine bush, because he exhibited empathy familially, nationally, universally on the human level with the Midianite women, and then with other living beings. And then God tells him, I'm also an empathic being. I have heard the cries of the children of Israel. So empathy, redemption starts with empathy and with humanizing the other. And the road to hell starts with dehumanizing and demonizing the other. Sachs reminds us that the people who gave the intellectual legitimization for Nazism were some of the 20th century greatest intellectual minds, including Martin Heidegger, whom we spoke about, if you recall, in this class, in the existentialism session, and Carl Schmitt. And he also reminds us of the chilling fact that most of the attendants of the Wannsee Conference, which formalized the so-called final solution to European Jewry, most of them were doctors. They were either PhDs or MDs. So that's part of the death blow to the secular Enlightenment misconception that education will usher in universal redemption. We've seen that some of the worst crimes against humanity were perpetrated, masterminded by people of great intellect and higher education. Bless you.
Thank you.
Rabbi. He talks about selected traumas, right? Salman bin Laden talks about the Crusades. Hitler spoke about the loss in World War II. Victimization is a big one, right? Victimization, that think about the Holocaust, Germany, the Jews are the source of everything that's happening in Germany. And then the final stage, perpetrating evil for an altruistic cause. Then there's the scapegoat theory in chapter 4. And he focuses on the Jews because the Jews were the quintessential scapegoat in both the Islamic world domain, Harb al-Islam, and both in the Christian domain throughout much of the last 2 millennia. So he says that today it's interesting that the Islamic world is ridden with Judeophobia, with anti-Semitism, and then he quotes a guy called René Girard, a French cultural anthropologist, who in his book Violence and Sanctity talks about infinite cycles of revenge. Right? Freud talked about the return of the repressed, that a group of people in a tribe killed their father, and afterwards they felt really bad that they killed dad, and they have those guilt feelings, and that's the return of the repressed. For Girard, he says that earlier societies in history didn't have LAPD and the court of law and the Supreme Court in D.C., so they had infinite cycles of violence. You see it in the Torah. You see it in the cities of refuge in the Torah. Cities of refuge were like these embassies. You could go in there and nobody can touch you, right? That's where the song "You Can Touch This" comes from. It's from the City of Refuge. Just trying to see if everybody's aware. So Girard makes a brilliant observation. He says the best way to stop bloodshed between two sides is to kill a third. To kill a third party. So let's give ourselves an example. Tsarist Russia, the Tsar wants to stay in power. The communists want to overthrow the Tsar or the socialists. What do they do together? Pogrom against the Jews. So he gives various examples of scapegoating throughout history, including the blood libels that started in Europe at 1144, right before lunchtime at 1144, and then in the 1800s, the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And then he talks about projection, and that's really interesting. He says, why were Jews, David? Welcome. Please have a seat. Thank you. He talks about the idea of projection. So, for example, imperialist empires accused Jews of trying to take over the world with the protocols of the Elders of Zion, but it was really a projection of their own imperialist desires to take over the world themselves, right? And similarly, he says that the blood libels saying that, these abominable accusations that, Jews take the corpse of a Christian child and they consume the blood like wine for Passover and the meat. He said it's a projection of actually what's going on in the Catholic Church, where you actually take in the body of Christ and you drink his blood. Okay? So here comes the dimension of projection. Now, projection is a very interesting thing, because if you think about it, psychologically we project all the time. And sometimes the people who push our buttons the most, sometimes, not always, sometimes they're just really bad people, but sometimes it's people that, there is something in them that reflects to us subconsciously something uncomfortable about ourselves. Okay. Now, let's continue. Sibling rivalry, that's really the core of the book, right? Sibling rivalry. So far we spoke about the following terms: identity, splitting, projecting, pathological dualism, scapegoating, and Lafrique Sashik. No? Okay.
That came out of people who were banned from entering a club, and that's where they wrote the song.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
There you go. Lafrique Sashik is about groupishness. Yeah, there you go. Unbelievable. That's interesting. Little did I know. Thank you. And then he talks about the, how does he call that, the passion to imitate? Anybody remembers the term? like that he's going to say that really Jacob wanted to be like Esau. He wanted to be loved by dad, and he wanted to be a jock, an athlete who's out in the field. What is the name of that passion? Mimetic?
Reverse identity?
It's mimetic.
Mimetic.
Reversible?
Mimetic. That will come too. But as Debbie said, the mimetic identity, and that comes from Girard.
Yeah.
What?
I want what someone has because they have it.
Right, exactly. So exactly. Like a kid when he sees another kid getting a new toy. And he says that all the gist of the sibling rivalries in Genesis, of course I mean the Phil Collins band, right? When I say Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
When I say Exodus, please know I mean Bob Marley. Okay. So in Genesis, right, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers, Cain and Abel, those foundational stories, and he basically said in all of them, what we have, on the face of it, we have a rejection narrative where Ishmael is out and Isaac is in. But then Sachs takes us into a closer reading of the text, and we see how we have these heart-wrenching narratives where Ishmael and Hagar are practically almost dying of thirst, and you see a mother crying for her child, and you have to have a heart of stone not to be affected by this and to have a sense of empathy, and how God's angel blesses Ishmael and Abraham blesses Ishmael, and ultimately says he too will become a great nation. And then he brings forth these very later midrashic works from the Islamic periods that construct this counter-narrative. That's a big word, a big term in this book, a counter-narrative, where Abraham goes to check out what's up with Ishmael, and Ishmael is, he went to Palm Springs for the weekend, but his wife is home, and the first wife doesn't want to give him something to eat and drink, and he leaves a message for Ishmael that he didn't marry into, he doesn't have the best spouse, and the next time he comes, he's married to somebody else, and that wife is very nice, and she orders something really good for him on Postmates, and he says, this time you married really well, right? So what he shows us is that, and the same thing with Jacob and Esau, he shows us that there was a second blessing, right? Right before Jacob was on the run, just before he flees to Haran to work with his uncle, his father gives him a blessing about posterity and the land, which is essentially the blessing of the covenant.
Children.
And before that, he got, his brother, the land and children. And before that, he gave him his brothers, which was about money and wealth and physical abundance. Right. And he says, what Jacob ultimately learned with that nocturnal encounter with the angel, in which he got the name Israel, is be yourself, or in existentialist parlance, be authentic, and seek the blessing that is meant for you, because God loves you for who you are, right? Not for who you are not, and not for what somebody else is. And then he's trying to rid monotheism of this zero-sum game, right? And he shows that Christianity and Islam are not immune to it, that they have this notion too. It started with Paul, Shaul HaTarasi, the Jew who basically created universal Christianity in the Gentile church, and said that that the Christians, those are Isaac, and the Jews are Ishmael, right? That the Christians are Jacob, and the old Jews who don't accept Christ are Esau. It's the same idea, right? That we, the Christians, are the chosen, and the Jews are out. They missed the boat. That's exactly the quotations that he brings from Paul, and then he brings other quotes from early Christianity, 3rd, 4th century, that took it a step further, which really, I think, starts the path to the murder of our people culminating in the Holocaust, is when they said that the Cain and Abel story is that it's the Jews killing Christ. And Cain is condemned for perpetual exile with the mark of shame on his forehead, and that represents the wandering Jew, right? And then came Islam, and basically said that Christianity and Judaism don't get it, right? And actually Ishmael is the chosen son, but the Jews forged the Torah and things of that nature. And what he's trying to do is to make room for a reading in which everybody is blessed by God. Everybody has a different blessing, a different vocation. Now I'll share with you something fascinating. If you haven't read a lot by Jonathan Sacks, anything by him is beyond excellent, and anything you will read by him will empower you incalculably as Jews, as Jewish educators, and will give you endless material to teach, to inspire, to learn, to grow. And Sacks wrote a book after 9/11 called The Dignity of Difference. And in that book, it's really like the first draft for this book, in a sense, like in embryonic form. So he had a chapter in that book, The Dignity of Difference, called Exorcising Plato's Ghost. What's Plato's ghost? That there's only one exclusive supernal truth. One and no other. And he was then the chief rabbi of the UK. Now he's like the global rabbi. He has hundreds of thousands of adherents. And the Haredi camp in Britain basically told them, you have to take it out. You have to take it out because we considered this heresy. To say that, we Jews have our truth, but Christians, Muslims, they have their truth, and they're all truth. There's just a multiplicity of different truth. It's not something we can accept, right? So he actually had to take out that chapter from future editions of the book. And I heard him give an interview sometime in the last 2 years that I almost fell off my seat, because he talked about leadership in crisis. And he has a whole collection of commentary on the Torah about lessons in leadership, which is an absolute must if you are or if you're going into leadership. He even has like a great one for Parsha Bascha about depression in leadership with Moses, incredible things. But he said that he seriously contemplated resigning the rabbinate at that point. And he decided he would be more effective to remain chief rabbi and to finish the business with that after he's done with his chief rabbinate. But I just wanted you to know that staggering biographical element. So I spoke about Paul and Islam and Christianity, and to reiterate, as he says, every attempt to find a substitute for religion brought down something monstrous like fascism, Nazism, Stalinist, or Chinese communism. And then again we had groupish identity and pathological dualism, and the politics of hate, which is a very successful thing nowadays, right? Welcome, Elisha. The politics of hate and the politics of fear is a very successful commodity to our chagrin. He has this brilliant reading of Cain and Abel, right? And he says that Abel comes from Hevel, which is a short breath. Like if you're in Illinois with Jenny Bundy and it's really cold and you go out and it's like you take a breath and you see the cold air coming out of your mouth, that's Hevel, right? And then he says, what is Cain? It comes from the Hebrew same root as kinyan, which means, right, acquisition. So this whole point that you can acquire love by force is a completely misguided kind of notion.
In there, he manages to make the case unbelievable. The foreshadowing of of the way human nature is going to go to this day and onward, the struggle between the material and the transitory and the spiritual.
There's a book by Gabriel Marcel, the French Catholic existentialist, called Avoir ou être, which it's magnificent in French because it's only 3 words, and basically means having or being. It works in English too, having or being. And he quotes the fascinating Rambam on Genesis 16:6 that Sarai afflicted, tortured Hagar, and Hagar fled from her. And Nachmanides, the great Kabbalistic Spanish sage, says, Chata imenu ba'imru yazeh. Sarah, our matriarch, sinned in this affliction, and Abraham too. And because of that, their descendants suffered all sorts of afflictions from the hand of the descendants of Ishmael, from Islam. That's like a pretty incredible reading, because usually, of course, the medieval rabbinic commentators want to give really good press and PR to the matriarchs and patriarchs, and to see that kind of commentary is pretty outstanding, right? This self-critique. And then Sachs renders he says, look at the antithesis between the binding of Isis and the expulsion of Ishmael. That in the expulsion of Ishmael we have these heart-wrenching emotive scenes, and in the binding of Isaac we have this kind of textual and emotive paucity. It's a very parsimonious text, right? And that's that. And his argument is that Ishmael and Esau weren't blessed because they are powerful in the ways of the world. They are physically powerful. They have an ability to fend for themselves and to support themselves. And the weaker siblings, yes? Excuse me?
Whiteboard.
We need it for the class. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So he said, the reason the youngsters are chosen is because the older siblings are powerful enough, left to their own devices, and they get their own blessings too. And then he has a chapter called "The Rejection of Rejection." Now, why is everybody laughing? What am I missing? Because I see Cynthia and Jenny. What is it?
It's just that as soon as you mentioned lessons in leadership, we both went and looked it up on Amazon.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that would be a good purchase. But let me tell you also that all of Covenant and Conversation by Sachs, all his commentaries are available online.
Yes.
But I recommend that you actually do buy it for your own library, because it'll be very handy for you when you want to look for a sermon or a Dvar Torah. Just take it out.
It's called Covenant and Conversation.
It's called Covenant and Conversation, yeah. So what's the rejection of rejection? Yeah, I always like when I download the video to see the chats that you guys are having. They talk about, you know what they talk about? They talk about shimmer and shine and all these things. Yeah. Okay. My girls talk about shimmer. So what's the rejection of rejection? It's Rabbi Sachs is making a pun on a term coined by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, two in the negation of negation. That's what the rejection of rejection is, basically rejecting the conventional reading that one brother is it and the other brother is out. We reject that narrative of rejection by this counter narrative that everybody is blessed in their own distinct and worthy way, right? So I spoke about everything that I'm looking at here. And this is the rejection of rejection. Okay. So we have just give me, another 15 minutes. I'm going to finish this, and then the second half, you guys will do the talking. I'm going into the third part. he gives, which starts with chapter 10, right? The third part, the open heart, right? And he talks about the amazing story of Csonad Szegedy, who was a Hungarian fascist. He was one of the leading fascist anti-Semitic forces. You know the story? In Hungary, really vile anti-Semitism. And he found out at some point that his mother is an Auschwitz survivor and that he's Jewish. It's an unbelievable story. And he started coming to shul. He wanted to meet with Shlomo Shochet, I think his name is, the Chabad rabbi of Budapest. They thought it was a joke. And then there was this debate at the board of the shul, should we let him in? You know, and the guy ultimately he is a practicing Jew, and he reads Hebrew, and he prays, and he has a Jewish name. And he basically, Sachs takes him as a prime real-life example of what happens when you are able to fully put yourself in the shoes of the other, right? By the way, there are some Levinasian motifs in this book.
Yes.
That are really great. For example, when the brothers are seeing Joseph approaching,
I love that.
And they plan to kill him as soon as they see him, he says how easy it is to kill when you don't see somebody's face, when they're at a distance, right?
You objectify.
Right, and then that Jacob saw God panim el panim, face to face, with that nocturnal encounter with the angel, and it's only because of that he finally made peace with who he is. So there's a lot of that.
Thanks to you, I got excited when I saw Emmanuel Levinas's name there. Good thing you assigned Levinas before Sachs.
Yeah, it worked. And he brings the incredible verse from Exodus 23:9. Remember that Exodus is Bob Marley? And it says, Va'atem yedatem et nefesh hager. And you should know the soul of the stranger. Know the soul of the stranger. You know, that's a very incredibly psychologically pervasive mitzvah. It's not just treat the stranger fairly. You should know the soul of the stranger. Because you yourselves were strangers in Egypt. So the Torah calls the Exodus at some point Ku HaBarzel, which means the iron furnace that molded us as a people. And it is that not only transformative and formative experience, but also we use that to be able to have empathy towards others in similar situations.
Excuse me, Rabbi, that was 22, Shemot?
Let me see. 23:9.
Thank you.
So that was the idea of role reversal. He talks about the universality of justice and the particularity of love, which I think is very important. We can only truly love a limited amount of people, but to be committed to justice, that's universal. That is not, there's no paucity when it comes to love. And then he says love is not a zero-sum game. Grow up, monotheists. If God loves the Jewish people, it doesn't mean he can't love the Christians or the Muslims or vice versa, right? There's enough to go around, certainly when it comes to divine love, right? Divine love, for sure, is infinite. And then he talks about, right, we have 3 covenants in the Torah. The first covenant, what is a covenant? It's an unconditional, perpetual, existential bond, as opposed to a transactional agreement, which is bound by time, circumstances, and conditions. So a covenant, a brit, is a perpetual, existential, unconditional bond that can never be rendered null and void. And we have 3 of them, right? With Abraham and his family and God, with Noah and his descendants after the flood, and with the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. And what he's saying is that this shows us that, the Bible makes room for particular love and for universal love. And this idea that there can be a particular love without a universal love kind of leads to a monstrosity. He says that the story of the generation of the flood shows us what happened when we have groups fighting each other without law and order. It's kind of like anarchy, right? And what happens with the story of the Tower of Babel is what happens when there is an attempt to create coercive uniformity, a la what we read with Yeshayahu Leibovich's commentary, right, on the Tower of Babel. But Sachs take us to the origin, which is the Naziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who is the first one who came up with this, and he kind of understood that point, even though he died several decades before the Russian Revolution. So, I would really want to finish this. I think I will. So what else do I have here for you? Okay, I don't think that... okay, he has chapter 12 is called Hard Texts. And he talks about, all the parts in the Torah that really sucked, like execute the rebellious son, who is, who listens to heavy metal in his room all day long, and the book of Joshua, extermination wars, and all kinds of things like that. And he talks about the importance of mediating texts, right? That we have, especially in Islam and in Judaism, and as you may recall, as I told you earlier in the class, Rabbi Sachs defines fundamentalism in typical genius as the leap from text to application without interpretation, right? And that's the leap from text to application without interpretation. And that's what you see with ISIS today. They want to resort to what they see as some sort of a pristine, pure, a la 7th century Islam, where you actually behead people or burn them alive, right? So imagine if, God forbid, we would have a Jewish group that would do verbatim what the Torah says without the mediation of the Mishnah and the Talmud. So that sort of thing. And he shows how the Talmud and later rabbis, including Maimonides, kind of rendered neutral some of these very violent and visceral texts, and how the Hasidic masters kind of psychologized the concept of Amalek from a concrete ethnic group to an internal struggle within the soul against the demonic from within. That's Rabbi Yitzhak Levi of Berdichev. And there's a similar concept in Islam. They talk about the big jihad and the small jihad. And the big jihad is against your own demonic forces from within. And the small jihad is the political jihad. So talks about how the religions had to cede power. Christianity after the rise of the Enlightenment, and Judaism after the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century. And he says, what an incredible historical irony that Judaism's political terrestrial defeat to the Romans ushered in its greatest spiritual victory in history, and the birth of textual rabbinic Judaism. Make sense? Yeah? Does that make sense? Okay, good. I'm really almost done here. Just need a couple of minutes. He sees the Bible as a continuous critique of political power. And that in Judaism, the state is a necessary evil. Remember, guys, last time that I wrote on the board this Mishnah from Pirkei Avot, pray for the welfare of government, for had it not been for the welfare of government, each person would swallow his or her fellow person alive. Right? And he says politics leads in power, and religion addresses the eternal and things of that nature. So talking about speaking truth to power, and religion is at its best when it rejects the temptations of the political, and chooses in its stead influence over politics. Influence is what Dr. King had, what Mahatma Gandhi had, what Heschel had, right? What Moses had, what Abraham had. So influence rather than institutionalized power. Then the most beautiful part for me is psychologically It's chapter 14, letting go of hate. Deuteronomy 23:8, don't despise an Egyptian, for you were a stranger in his land. And he says, in order to be free, you have to let go of hate. Now think about it, both in terms of the people who really hurt you in your life, toxic people, and think about it also on a national level. He basically makes the very powerful point that by not looking back, by letting go of hate, you're emancipating yourself from the toxicity and embittered state of being a hater. In other words, more than hate harms the hated, it harms the hater. Make sense? And you know, it's very instructive. You see groups like the Jewish people who underwent genocide and moved on. We will never forget. We always make time to cry and mourn, but we don't live in victimization. So that's another important term that he has in the book, is victimization. It is, there are cultures out there that are stuck in a state, a political and collective mental state of victimization. And you can't be free when you are held mentally captive and emotionally captive by victimization. I think it's a very... And then he has this ingenious commentary on Lot's wife, who turned around, right? And she saw that the lot was full. No, they were not allowed to look back. And then she looked back, and she turned into a pillar of salt. So Sachs's interpretation is that she looked back on everything that they had, and that they physically lost as they ran, and she couldn't free herself of her past. And that's why she stagnated. She couldn't move forward in life, if you like. Right? Very interesting.
That was brilliant.
That's heavy.
Yeah, that's a... And he concludes by saying the will to power or the will to life. And this is where he talks about Cain and Abel. And basically he says when you see Jewish fundamentalists or Christian fundamentalists or Islamic fundamentalists murder in the name of God, then it's really about the will to power. It's about getting Jewish power, Islamic power, right? Osama bin Laden used to speak about the Ummah. Ummah in Hebrew, Ummah, means nation, right? So he talks about the power of the nation, to reconsolidate the Islamic empire. The Islamic empire is a political force, right? Or people who want to create the kingdom of Judea over the West Bank, Jewish zealots. So he says this kind of political fundamentalism is not about piety. It is about what Nietzsche called the will to power, earthly, terrestrial, political, economic power. It's not about spirituality. Okay, so anything else here? I think I should be done. Oh, he also, I think that's very important, he negates the argument from some people on the very fringes of the radical left that terrorism may be seen as legitimate because it is the shrieking of the weak. And he rejects that. He said you cannot justify crimes against humanity, and those who are, have a lesser hand economically, politically, and militarily have other more worthy tools to resort to, as did Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, civil disobedience. And he says that, crimes against humanity, murdering civilian innocents, is a bad means for a bad end. So that's basically what I have to say about the book. So it's 2:17. Let's